Hello, good morning, and welcome to this, our second in our series of webinars on the Building Safety Bill. I'm Geoff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. For those of you that haven't come across me before, where have you been? I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. We're licensed approved inspectors, and I'm also the building regs expert for Architects Journal. If you have come along to this and this is the first one of these webinars that you've attended, then if you head along to our YouTube channel, you can find the previous ones in the series. Also, we'll be making those available in due course on the YouTube channel, and you'll also find other content there as well. Now, as far as today is concerned, we're really going to be focusing on existing buildings and some of the challenges that's being presented. In our previous webinar, we've given some general background to the Building Safety Bill itself, and in particular how this applies to new buildings and new construction projects, and discuss the gateways, etc. So if you're not familiar with that, it's probably worth taking some time out afterwards to check through that. Today's focus, as I say, is on existing buildings. Now, the plan of action is that we'll be talking about Dame Hackett's report, how that's translated itself into some of the suggested requirements within the Building Safety Bill itself. We'll be talking about the safety case, and that's really the fundamental part of what we're chatting about today. We're going to be looking at how that applies to these existing buildings. We'll be touching briefly on responsibility, but our main focus, as I say, will be on the fire safety case. We'll be looking into clauses 72 to 74, which, don't worry, I'm not going to be spending all day talking about clause numbers. We'll be talking about assessment of risk. We're going to be looking at how we can hopefully prevent major incidents, and we'll be looking at the concept of ALARP, which I will explain for those of you who are not familiar with it. We're going to then be spending a bit of time looking at how this translates from the whole concept side of stuff into the construction industry and fire safety industry in particular. And we'll be looking at some of the guidance, and I'm going to briefly, and I do mean briefly, touch on BS 8629 towards the end of it. So hopefully that is going to cover a lot of the issues that you were hoping that today's webinar would cover. If there is something in there that I haven't covered, or that you were hoping to get out of today, if you can pop that over into the chat, that will come up on screen. I'll probably look over to the side and just see what's occurring, and then I can either address that during the course of the webinar, or alternatively we can open stuff up for more questions and answers at the end. Now, I appreciate that today's session probably is going to create a lot of questions, particularly for those who have come back from the first webinar, have had a chance to take some of that in, and now want to start asking some questions. So I'm happy to deal with some of those at the end as well. Okay, so let's get going with today's webinar. We'll start obviously with the report by Dame Hackett herself. Now, within that, in the Building a Safer Future report, Dame Hackett started to talk about the concept of a fire safety case, or safety case, and information management, and how that was going to become part of the future system. Now, for the construction industry, to a degree, this is a whole new concept. We've not really spoken in the past about the safety case, so I'm just going to briefly touch on where this has kind of come from, and the reasons why Dame Hackett is particularly keen on that. So going back in time, in the UK, since about 1974 before, there was a report called the Robbins report, and this looked into the balance of safety within a number of industries. Now, this was taken through with the concept of the safety case into a number of industries, and it's common practice in, for example, the chemical industry and the petrochemical industry, and those kind of, in nuclear industry. So those kind of really high risk, rare but high risk, catastrophic kind of incidents. So that's what Dame Hackett is looking at in the context of the construction industry, and in particular these buildings that we're identifying as being high risk, and we'll touch on the discussion as to what the hell high risk actually is. And within the concept of the safety case, there are a couple of terms that will frequently be used. There's ALARP, which is as low as reasonably practicable, and as safe as reasonably practicable. So you'll start to see some of this terminology entering into the way in which we start to address buildings, and we address the building control and fire safety regime going forwards. Now, when we talk about this, as I say, that we are new to this as an industry. We don't have a particularly good record of putting this information together, and how we track it and how we use it. Now, with an existing building, it's going to be quite different to the situation with a new building. When we're actually constructing a new building, there's every opportunity for us to complete that all-important digital record. Having those important records, the plans, the details of the products that we use, all of that information can quite easily and readily be collected during the course of the project as it's being put together. We can then collate that into the infamous golden thread, and at the end of the project we will have that, and you will, as a building manager or the building owner, have all the information that you need in order to be able to manage the risk going forwards. Now, that's very different to the situation that we have with existing buildings, and also where we start to determine the level of risk actually being. Now, in Dame Hackett's report, she was originally talking about buildings over 10 stories in height. And we've had various discussions about what level that will be, whether it's 18 metres, whether it's 10 stories, whether it's potentially as low as 11 metres in height. Now, just to put that into some kind of context, when we're talking 11 metres in height, depending on exactly how you're defining it, a 5-storey Victorian building could potentially be dropping into that quite easily. If you've got 5 stories, and each one of those is 2.5 metres in height, you can see how a building of that kind of size is caught by that. So all of a sudden, we're not talking about huge tower blocks, we're talking about a very large proportion of the existing housing stock and the way in which we currently live and utilise these buildings. So there's a lot to be thought about within that, and also in particular how that's going to affect new developments where we're doing stuff like airspace development. For those of you who are not clear on what airspace is, the government have relaxed a number of the planning rules and now allow you to stick additional stories on top of an existing building. Now, before you're going to be able to do that, really you should be looking at the existing fire safety case for the building and ensuring that's as safe as reasonably practical, and then taking a look at the effect of adding the additional stories on. Now, when we're talking about this, it's worth bearing in mind that originally we identified that there were probably somewhere in the region about 2,000 to 3,000 existing buildings that were falling within the categories that Dame Hackett had originally suggested. If we're opening that up to buildings of 11 metres in height, then all of a sudden, as I say, we're into thousands upon thousands of these buildings. And we've already seen with the issues that we have with EWS1 that we have a lack of qualified fire safety people to be carrying these out. So how are we going to get to the point of having a fire safety case for all of these existing buildings? Well, the first port of call here almost certainly is going to be the fire risk assessment. So all of these buildings should have a fire risk assessment already carried out on them, as well we all know under the existing legislation. But equally, as we know, the quality and standard of these fire risk assessments varies quite dramatically. And this can cause the owners of the buildings to find that the amount of information they've got is really limited. And almost invariably, the fire risk assessments that have been carried out on a non-invasive basis. I mean, certainly I would say almost all of the fire risk assessments that we as a company have been asked to do over the years have always been quite clear that you were not able to go into perhaps individual flats, or you weren't able to take parts of the existing cladding off. And it's only now that we're starting to get into that. Without that information, we're not going to be able to put together the database. We're not going to be able to really look in depth at the fire safety case. So there's an enormous amount of work going to be required over the forthcoming months and years to actually go into these buildings and collect the data that we need. And we need to have a clear, concise and easy platform for us to collect that data and to do so in a uniformed manner. So there's quite a lot of tech challenges there that I'm not going to particularly go into today. I think there are a couple of people on the webinar today who might actually be in a much better position than me to actually explain that in more depth, as they're more on the techie side of stuff. But the point that I'm making here is that what we do need to do is we need to go in and look at all of those existing fire risk assessments and identify the issues. Now, what's typically happened over the years with most fire risk assessments is it was seen as a tick box exercise. People went in, they carried out a fire risk assessment, and at best, even if they were picked up correctly, they were done in some detail and were passed on to the owners, what would typically happen is that they would be filed away. There wasn't any real attempt in most cases to put together a true and proper fire safety case. So when we're talking about that, again, what are we talking about? We're talking about making a proper assessment of the building and what the fire safety actually looks at. Now, when we go through that, it's important to understand some of the responsibilities that come in here. Now, I'm not focusing today in great depth on the responsibility of each of the various parties within the makeup. But you are going to have a building safety manager who is going to be the principal person who's going to have the responsibility for reporting this back to effectively the landlord. And you are also going to have to involve each of the individual tenants or leaseholders, which is going to be an interesting discussion, I'm sure, as we go through today, as to who actually has responsibility for ensuring that these are carried out, who has responsibility for making sure that access is actually in place. When we look at what's being talked about, it's quite important as well to say that the way that the bill has been worded up till now focuses specifically on the life safety risk. So this is all about still the criticality of life safety. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to prevent a major life safety incident. That's what the purpose of this is about, and trying to reduce the level of risk within any of these buildings down to minimize the chances of there being basically another Grenfell Tower or a Lockerbie or any of the other major incidents that there have been. How can we prevent major life loss? It doesn't address, as I say, property protection, and it doesn't address life safety risk in the same way to smaller buildings where there are lesser numbers. So this is about low frequency, high consequence situations and how we can prevent those. And there's quite a lot that we can learn from other industries and the way in which they have gone about stuff in understanding what the challenges are going to be for us as an industry as we move into the next stage. So this brings us on in particular, and I'm going to make some reference to clauses, which I hate doing because no one really is that interested in clause numbers. But I really do need to just draw your attention to a number of the clauses within the bill itself. And in particular, we're talking, as I say, about clauses 72 to 74. So if you haven't had the chance to go into the documentation and have a look at that and just see what it says, then it's important probably after today, go across, get a copy of it and take a look at those specific elements. Now, as I say, within a new build, you would have gateways 1, 2 and 3. So that would give you a lot of the information that you actually require. Now, clause 72 is the one that actually requires that there is an assessment of the safety risk itself, and basically says it provides that every accountable person is under an ongoing obligation to carry out an assessment of the building safety risks arising from the higher risk building for which they are responsible. The definition of safety risk, as I say, is yet to be finalised. The Act itself, when it comes about, will have the ability to define what a higher risk building actually is. And this is where the discussion about 18 metres or 11 metres or whatever else starts to come into play. And you will see just how far and wide ranging these are. Where the building is an existing building, then this really is where clause 73 starts to kick in. And this is where there's a requirement for even existing buildings to have this ongoing duty with the accountable person to take all reasonable steps and actions necessary to prevent a major accident, incident or fire arising within their building. Now, this, as I say, starts to get into a discussion about as low as reasonably practical and as safe as reasonably practical. Now, these are not terms that within the building control industry, at least, and to a fair degree within the fire safety industry, we're particularly familiar with. These are really coming from Dame Hackett's experience at the Health and Safety Executive and the way in which the CDM regulations were put together. So it's perhaps worth me just touching for a moment or two on what as low as reasonably practical actually is and how that differs within an existing building to the benchmark that we currently apply under building regulations. For those of you that aren't familiar with the building regulations in any great depth, the test or benchmark, if you're carrying out work to an existing building, isn't that you reduce the risk down as low as reasonably practical. It's basically that you comply with a minimum standard, which is prescribed or not prescribed. We'll cover that in a moment. But even then, you're not necessarily required to meet that. And let me explain. Within the requirements for a material alterations, that's when you've got an existing building and you're altering that building, the building regs benchmark is actually that you've made the building no worse than it was before you carried the work out. Now, that's a major difference between that and as low as reasonably practical. So, for example, if you had a building beforehand that had no fire doors, and the building afterwards has no fire doors, but you've installed possibly a fire alarm, you've made it better than it was before. It's therefore no worse than it was previously, so therefore it's compliant, but it still hasn't got any fire doors. And you can quite easily turn around and say, well, to reduce this risk to as low as reasonably practical, surely to goodness we should be putting fire doors in. So you can start to see how this starts to differ in the entire approach that we've had up until now and going forwards. So where actually are these definitions? So as I say, ALARP is short for as low as reasonably practical. If you look in the health and safety regs, you'll find so far as reasonably practical is regularly used, and we're anticipating that when the final bill comes and the guidance is there, you need to be looking at that and how reasonably practical actually involves a level of risk assessment, because that's what this all comes down to. At the end of the day, it's going to be a risk assessed basis. So, given the fact it's risk assessed, that means by its nature, it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you that this is what you have to do. For example, it doesn't say this is to reduce it down to a maximum of 2 fire deaths every 10 years. It doesn't say, to use from other industries, that we're going to have no more than 1 accident on site within any particular period. Reasonably practical was actually defined by the Court of Appeal as far back as 1949 in a case called the Coalboard case. Basically, what I'll do is I'll quickly pick up on that one. In say 1949, there was a case of Edwards versus the National Coal Board. Now, this required that control measures need to be implemented regardless of whether they're expensive or will put time in place, provided they are proportionate. So, for high risks, such as multiple fire safety deaths, it would be reasonable to assume that you would expend a high amount of time, money, and effort to control it. What some of the things that will be happening from this new building safety body, the building regulatory body, they'll be looking at and they'll be asking you questions. If the event that something happens, has good practice been followed? Was there any more that could have been done? And if there was, what controls were put in place? Why were decisions made? And to what extent were cost and time relevant to those? So if we look at some of the examples that there are out there, just to give you a very quick flavour of stuff beyond the fire safety side of stuff, let's take a look at dust suppression as an example. Now, dust could be considered as a nuisance, but it's also a health hazard for those in and around the area where the dust is being produced. Silica dust, as an example, apparently kills around 800 people in the UK each year. So as a result of that, it's proportionate and good practice to control dust exposure. So what does that mean? Well, the obvious thing to do is to provide the person carrying out the work with a dust mask. So is that all that's required? Well, I would suggest the answer to that is no, because there are people beyond the person that's directly affected who could also be affected. So therefore, we should look to suppress the dust itself. So we're then in a position where we're actually looking at dampening down. So water jets, those kind of things. So you combat the dust at source, or extraction, or other controls. So you can see how this starts to build up a sequence. And one of the other things that's quite clear within the guidance and regulation is that it's important that you don't rely on one fire safety element and one fire safety element alone, and that what you need to have is you need to have an element of redundancy or criticality. So in the event that one thing were to fail, that there are other things that are there that can help to provide the cover overall. So to give you, for example, more specific to what we're looking at today, simply providing sprinklers within a building and not providing any fire doors would mean that during the period of time when the sprinklers were being commissioned, or there were issues over water supply or whatever, then there would be no second backup measure. So would it be proportionate to have other measures in place? And the quick answer to that, when we're talking about fire safety, is blatantly yes. So let's flip that on its head. Okay, we put fire doors in place. If there was a risk that the fire doors were to fail for whatever reason, let's say we're having an argument about the gaps around the door being 3 millimeters or 5 millimeters. Are there other mechanisms in place? Are there other fire safety measures, or is that all that we're relying on? If the building is also sprinklered, it also has smoke control systems, it also has good compartmentation, it has all of these other things, then those issues become slightly less of an issue when we're looking at as low as reasonably practical. So that would be a balance between what we need to do on one side and what we need to do in another. Now, how is this going to be affected? How is it going to be enforced? Well, in 2018, a manufacturer was prosecuted and fined over £80,000 for failing to reduce risks to as low as reasonably practical. In 2017, a worker was crushed and broke 14 ribs when a forklift truck hit a pile of roof trusses, which then fell on him. The courts found that the controls, including safe methods of delivering the work on site, training and supervision, could have prevented the accident. But because they weren't implemented across the board, that meant that it wasn't reduced down to a level that was as low as reasonably practical. There are many of these examples, and if you go and have a look on the HSE website, you'll get a feel for how this is going to be enforced afterwards, and how you're going to have to put together a fire safety case that starts to address all of these issues and starts to reduce them down to a level that you can actually minimize and you can justify. So where is the guidance that you can follow and start doing this now? Because Dame Hackett quite reasonably and quite sensibly has said, go out there and start doing this. Don't wait for the bill. Start doing this now. Start collecting the data. Start making those risk assessments. So where is the guidance? Well, the quick answer to that is, frankly, there isn't really much in the way of guidance. The main piece of guidance that kind of falls within this as low as reasonably practical approach is probably the fire safety in multi-purpose blocks of flats guides produced by the LGA, although technically that's been withdrawn at the moment. Because it clearly doesn't reflect current best practice. And as the regulations have changed and altered, and we're now talking about sprinklers in buildings below 18 metres in height, we're now bringing that down to 11 metres, and we're talking about a whole series of other things, timber balconies, combustible construction on the outside of buildings. These are things that are not contained within that guide in any particular level. So the government is in the process of updating those guides, and as far as I'm aware, the author of the original guide, C.S. Todd, are going to be the organisation that are going to be taking this forward to the next version of that. So that's going to give us, I think, a bit of an idea and a bit of a steer. At the moment, as I say, it's a bit of guesswork on my part. It's a bit of guesswork on anyone's part. If anyone's turning around to you and saying they know exactly how this is going to pan out, they're a better man than I, because nobody does at the moment. But this is my best guess. It's a bit of an educated guess. But I think if you start looking at that LGA guide, it's going to give you a feel for how this is going to work forwards. So if you go to that document, towards the back of it, there's a series of appendices that give a series of potential case studies. So, for example, and pardon me if I'm reading from some of this, but it's a lot to have taken in and remembered automatically. But for example, in Appendix 9, there's a case study there of a 9-storey block that had a number of issues. As a result of the initial fire risk assessment, they identified that there were a series of measures that meant that they had to go from a Type 1 to a Type 2 survey, and they needed to upgrade a number of the fire safety measures, which were typical for a 1960 purpose-built block. This particular 9-storey single staircase block had a total of 51 self-contained general needs flats, 6 per floor, which are accessed through a common lobby off a single stairway. And this, I'm going to jump in immediately at this point and say, and this is where really things start to fall apart when you're looking at as low as reasonably practical. Because if you have got a situation where you've got a single stair, there is a significant chance that that could, for one reason or another, be unavailable. So what is the plan then? Where is our plan B? Where have we got the second measure in case of the failure of the first one? And that's really where the safety case and what goes on in the chemical industry and the nuclear industry and everything else really starts to kick in. Because I say, obviously, if you were reliant solely on the cooling mechanism within a nuclear reactor, and for whatever reason you had a failure on that, that's going to be a pretty critical failure. So what other measures are in place in case there was an issue with that for any reason? So you're going to have to look at building in a degree of redundancy within anything that you do and how you justify stuff in order to make that work. I'll get back to the case study. Access to the flats was via a common lobby with two-door protection. It's typical of the kind of blocks that I'm sure many of us have seen, either during a fire safety audit or because we actually happen to live there. You know, these are people's homes. They're not just random case studies and random examples, as is often put across. Typically, these had refuse chutes which were down, you had open balconies, and you had a situation where you had potential risks opening onto the stairway itself. So what did the fire safety case for that particular building start to look at? Well, it immediately identified that although there were minor openings in floors and cables and stuff, overall the standard of compartmentation in the building was generally good, but further investigation was needed, and that providing that those areas could be fire stopped, it was reasonable to assume that it had good levels of compartmentation overall. So that's almost certainly what you're going to see as the first step, is that let's start to open stuff up and see what's actually there. Now that's where we're going to see a whole series of problems, because we know that the quality control on these buildings over the course of the past 20 odd years has not been as it should be. I mean, just to give you an example of a simple case yesterday, I'd gone down to a block which is being converted, and during the course of the inspection, the ceiling was made up of 2 layers of soundboard. It had a rock wall type insulation in there, and then had like an existing clinker floor. All of the services have been fire stopped through. But as part of the overall makeup and the acoustic and fire separation properties, the rock wall element produces a part of the insulation to it. But what had happened was that the electrician had gone in, and as part of the process of fixing the downlighters and the cabling for the downlighters, had actually pulled great sections of the insulation out in order to fit the light, in the belief that the light needed space around it because it would get hot, and it could catch fire to the insulation. So we'd ended up with a situation where an electrician had come in and, thinking that they were doing the best thing possible, had actually removed some insulation. Now, unless I'd happened to be there at that particular point in time, we wouldn't have seen that. So we could quite happily have gone in there, seen all the insulation in place, come back a day later, and as far as we could tell, the cabling had been pulled through, and that was it. Everything was as we believed it to be. However, when you then open the building up in years to come, you'll find that the insulation that you thought was there isn't actually there. And that's where this keeping of records and information almost on a daily basis, having a daily survey of it and keeping on top and making sure that these things are actually in place becomes vital. I've digressed slightly. So coming back to the key points. So what was being suggested as some of the appropriate measures for this building? Well, as short-term solutions, there was a requirement for the leaseholders to replace the front doors in their flats with certified FD30S doors with positive action self-closers, because the doors that were there were actually called into doubt. We've all seen them. We've seen them with the letterboxes. We've seen them without self-closers. We've seen them in all sorts of awful standards. In some cases, PVC doors, glass panels to them, all sorts of stuff. So if we haven't got that first line of protection to the staircases, then that's going to be an issue. Now that immediately presents an issue in actually implementing it, because how do you get access to be able to do that upgrade? And this is where the fire safety bill is going to start putting those things in place to enable you to effectively enforce that upon the tenants, the residents within there. And also to ensure that any of the internal doors that were required to form part of the internal protected hallway were still in place as well. As a temporary measure, one of the suggestions was that in order to provide some smoke ventilation, that they permanently opened one of the windows on each landing within the stairway, that you provided fire stopping throughout. Then they were saying that in the more medium term, you sort out these refuse chutes, which provided a link from one floor to another that could potentially spread fire from the bin stores throughout the whole of the building. To fit intermittent dampers to the services, particularly around the bathrooms, to prevent fire spread between flats, because this had a common ventilation system. To upgrade all of the flat entrance to all of the doors to the storerooms, to the cleaners cupboard, to the electrical intake, etc. And in the longer term, to look at the strategy overall. There was no automatic opening vent, there was no pressurization system, there was no firefighting lift. All of these things you would look and expect to see in a building of that height. So how can you do those? How can you start to include those? Now, one of the things that I think is going to become very much the base standard as we start looking ahead is to look at the alternative fire alarm systems and methods of warning that are out there, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But also, we're not going to be able to take a single staircase building and turn it into a two staircase building in almost any case that I can think of. So how can we improve the chances of evacuating people out there? And the quick answer to that is probably an evacuation lift. Now, that's not a full firefighting lift, but it is a mechanism by which the fire service could instigate an assisted evacuation from the building in the event that the staircase itself was unavailable. So you can see how that would give you some of this built-in redundancy and give you an alternative mechanism. It gives you a plan B. I think it's also, as I say, one of the critical elements moving forwards will be the discussion about fire alarms. Now, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about stay put and whether stay put works. My wholehearted belief is that for many, many, many years, stay put has worked, and there's no reason to assume that stay put can't work. It's the same basic concept that we use for the most vulnerable people that there are out there. Hospitals. Hospitals have effectively a stay put policy. So people are not evacuated out from wards. You don't tip out the whole hospital every time the fire alarm goes off. But in order to do that, you're reliant on high standards of compartmentation. So if we've got those high standards of compartmentation, then yes, it would appear to me that the most appropriate route is to maintain stay put. But we do need to have a plan B. Now, this in part is where Scotland have already moved ahead of the rules here in England. What you will have seen in Scotland, if anyone deals with that, is that they have made reference back to BS 8629. Now, this is a code of practice that enables a fire alarm system to be used by the fire service to initiate a full or partial evacuation of that high-rise building. So that's now forming part of the Scottish Domestic Technical Handbook, which is the equivalent of ADB, for those of you who are familiar in the case in England. Now, at the moment, the fire service are quite resistant, the NFCC are quite resistant to the concept of that being applied here in England and Wales, principally on the basis that it may be applied incorrectly. And we're regularly seeing on an almost daily basis clients coming to us and saying they want to put full evacuation into these buildings. That still doesn't seem to be the most appropriate route, particularly when you bear in mind that a lot of the residents of these buildings could be vulnerable, or they could have mobility issues, etc. So keeping a stay put with a plan B seems to be the most effective way of doing it. And what I think I would like to see is to go beyond the provision of the fire service activated system, so that you start to look at phased evacuation for our tower blocks, so that in the event that a single detector goes off within a single flat, the only people that are going to be tipping out at that point in time will be that individual flat. If it starts to spread into, say, a corridor, then with a bit of intelligence applied to the alarm system, you could evacuate people, say, on that floor, or that floor and the floor above. And if it starts to extend beyond that, then it could kick in and give a full alert throughout the building. But it's important, I think, more than anything, that we have communication. So when the fire service arrive on site, it's not just an alarm going on or off. If we can actually have a way of communicating so that we can understand exactly where people are within the building, so an intercom type system, so that we know that people are in flats numbers 7, 8, 9 on the 4th floor, then we can then think and say to them, yes, you can go and evacuate. That's where part of the problem with Grenfell Tower really came, because there wasn't a means of communicating with them. The fire service didn't know what the elements of risk are. Now, I know that a lot of people are calling for buildings to be full evacuation. The biggest difference between a residential block and a commercial block, hotels, etc., which I suppose is the nearest immediate obvious one, is that you have got fire wardens, you've got a maintained and checked system, and you've got, as I say, people effectively throughout the whole of the day being able to go around the building. Although we are starting to see hotels, and particularly on the back of the Airbnb type stuff, where that's not actually the case, although that's effectively what they are. So they don't have trained fire wardens in place, and they haven't got the evacuation plans in place. So it's important that if we do go down that line, how we're going to do that. So if we're going to end up with a situation, as a lot of people are calling for full evacuation, then that's why you need the waking watch kind of thing. And that's where a lot of the cost and implications come in. Surely we could look to getting these upgraded fire alarm systems in there. We could look to putting in an evacuation lift as part of an upgrade of the lift system. So these are things that could be done, are reasonably practical, and are cost effective. So it starts to fall within the bounds that I've set out. What I'll do is I'll draw today's webinar to a close. Hopefully you found that useful. If there are any suggestions for future topics to cover, or any areas that you want to look in any more detail, then please get in touch. You can do so through my email address, that's jeff@thebuildinginspector.org. You'll also find me on all of the socials, at Geoff Wilkinson on Twitter, for example. If you haven't already, then please connect with me on LinkedIn, and check out our website, where we'll be posting regular updates throughout the whole of the process and the transition through from the bill into the Fire Safety Act and everything else that goes with it. For those of you that have been, as ever, I thank you for listening. I've been Geoff Wilkinson, and that's it for today. Thank you very much.